I'm going to read my comments or I'll start crying if I don't. So, thank you, Steve Almond. You're awesome. I'm overwhelmed by your response to the story. I can't thank you enough. Thank you, everyone. Wow, I'm really getting choked up here. Not expecting to. Thank you to everyone at Philadelphia Stories, to Carla Spataro, to the tireless Christine Weiser, to everyone else who helps support and publish the journal. My heartfelt thanks to the family of Marguerite McGlinn. I just met Tom. To the Dry Family Foundation. I'm humbled and I'm thrilled to be here. I read Carla's tribute to Marguerite, and it's clear to me she was a woman who was very loved. This is a great honor to me to be in your company. I want to extend my love and my thanks to my sister, Colette McDonald, and my brother-in-law, Jimmy, who are here tonight. They live in Oxford, nearby. My gratitude to my husband, Damien Van Denberg. I'm looking at him right now. Always my first reader, for his support and his love. I also want to give a shout out to a great friend of mine, Thomas Glave, who's a great writer. And if I didn't have his friendship, I don't think I could have had the courage to write this story. So I'm going to read an excerpt from the middle of the story, To the Garden. Did have it named, swear. I just want to set it up briefly. The narrator is an angry young woman. She lives in what she calls a hard luck white area of Wilmington, Delaware. She's just graduated from Catholic high school. She's made no plans. She's drifted into a job as a file clerk at the A.O. DuPont Children's Hospital. She's got a lot to learn, and her unhappiness and her anger over being stuck over a miserable home life has blinded her in a lot of ways. I'm going to read for about 14 or 15 minutes. Wow. Okay. Maybe I should read that long. The records department had about a dozen employees, as I remember it. Big men in suits behind closed doors and women out on the floor in workstations. The women were nice to me, perhaps out of pity because I was so young and clueless. I saw them as figures in a benign but boring film, or as a kind of vaudeville backdrop being reeled behind me as I pantomimed walking in place. My head was where I lived, where my mythic self soared. The highlight of my workday was lunch, when I would walk out of the building, a utilitarian Pentagon-like place, and down the grass-flanked walkway and across the parking lot to my car. I would drive to Route 202, Concord Pike, which was where all the fast food places were, and take out some edible trash from places like Arby's or Taco Bell. Then, instead of staying and eating, I would drive around as I ate, mentally exploiting all the buildings I passed. I would blow up the Concord Mall, the ugly Methodist church, little brick building accountancies, the Arby's whose warm bacon cheeseburger I was grinding to bits in my hot little mouth. I had a special hatred for something called the Rollins Building, an oddly tall tower protected by an oversized moat-like green. It was like a giant dick on an otherwise flat landscape. Of course, I always had to go back to work after lunch. One of the nice older ladies would always ask me what I had for lunch, and I'd lie, just because I could. Oh, Mickey D's, I'd say, when I'd actually had Wendy's. Lying was something to do. One day when I did this, I heard a sharp intake of breath from the other file clerk, a woman named Keisha, who was, after me, the second youngest person there, about 24. She was the A to M file clerk. I was the N to Z. Keisha and I were civil, but didn't really have anything to say to each other. I always got the feeling around black people that I didn't hold any interest for them, that their society was closed, and that I wouldn't know how to talk with them anyway. Later, when it was just us, Keisha said to me, "I seen you at Wendy's." I was so shocked to have been found out in my meaningless lie that I immediately lied again. "You did not," I said haughtily. We looked at each other. I noticed Keisha now, as if I hadn't really looked at her before. She'd seemed like a dry young church lady to me when I'd first shaken her hand, but now I saw she had a canny look about her. She kept her hair severely pulled flat in a charmless plastic clip, but her face was shapely and unusual, with a smattering of freckles across high cheekbones and wide-set, watching eyes. And there was an amusement in those eyes, a boundless amusement. Okay, the fuck, I was at Wendy's, I finally said. What is that mouth, she said. I closed the file drawer I was working on and wheeled my cart away. Behind me I could hear her making a sound like I began to be curious about Keisha. She dressed about 50 years older than she was in dowdy acrylic cardigans, sensible polyester slacks, and an eternal pair of crepe-soled puckered shoes in a terrible light ochre color. On her sweaters was a procession of novelty brooches, of the kind you would see heaped in cheap little gift boxes in big bargain bins in front of discount stores like the Allmarts on Kirkwood Highway. I pictured Keisha there at Allmart's, tenderly looking through the gift boxes of $1 jewelry until she found the brooch that spoke to her. This scenario that I invented for Keisha depressed me beyond belief. But the horrendous, sad, hilarious brooches, the rhinestone-studded jack-in-the-box, the pseudo-marcasite daisy, the cat with emerald eyes, also somehow made me like her. Most of the young black women I saw around dressed very stylishly, very flash, with shingled hair and sleek red leather and enormous shrimp earrings in 18-karat gold. And so Keisha's old lady ways marked her for me as a serious, unfrivolous person, an emissary from another era, if not another planet, truth be told. She looked like no one I'd ever seen. I'm not exactly sure how it was we started talking one day. It wasn't long after the Wendy's episode, I do remember, and we'd drawn our carts up next to each other on either side of the MN divide. In my mind, she just opened her mouth and began. She had kind of offhand, buzzy delivery and would always start very softly with a series of throwaway words. It was as if she had every expectation to be ignored, and so wanted to give the other person an easy out if that person didn't choose to pick up the dialogue. So I was reading the other day in a library book about the Second World War II, she said, about the fascists and how they come to power, and everyone liked them at first because the country was a plain mess, and how the main guy, Busoli, was a strong, powerful leader, and they had one central person they could look up to now, and so everyone wanted to be a fascist too. I was holding a file in my hand, its edge marked with a bright red N sticker, staring at the letter and trying to figure out how I was supposed to respond. All sorts of things flashed through my mind. Was she bringing this up because I had an Italian last name? Was she making fun of me? It makes a soft sound. Fascist, I said. Fascist, she said loudly. Was she calling me a fascist? Yeah, I don't much like them, I said. She asked me why not. I said something about not liking people who insisted you only see their way, hating intolerant, brutal people, hating tyrants. Uh-huh, she said, edging her cart back up the alphabet away from me. I zoomed after her with my own cart, well out of my letter group, and found myself asking if she'd seen a photograph, a famous photograph of Mussolini, and I was careful to pronounce the name slowly, to articulate all the syllables. Had she ever seen that photograph of Mussolini, of his corpse actually, when they strung up him and his lover, strung them up upside down from a beam in front of a gas station. Their arms were flying out in front of them as if they were diving from a high ledge. They had tied up his lover's skirt because otherwise it would flop down over her face and be even more indecent. They'd strung him up there in that place because he had ordered the killing of a group of partisans, I said, resistance fighters, anti-fascists. The fascists had killed them and dumped their bodies in that same place. And so hanging him there was a reprisal. A reprisal, Keisha repeated. Yeah, like what goes around comes around, I said. We were staring deeply at each other. People in the records department generally talked about television, Weight Watchers, drugstore purchases. Here I was telling a black woman about a lynching. I'd best get back, I said, whittling down the alphabet. I'm not exactly sure how we started eating lunch together. I had a crap car, a late 70s Lemon, which my father had bought at an auto auction for $200 cash. It was tan, seriously uncool, and had a muffler that would come undone and scrape the ground if I hit a pothole, of which there were many in the city of Wilmington as I remember it. Once you got out of the city, however, the roads changed. Once you got north to the area through which the Brandywine Creek wended its way, once you got to the part of Newcastle County actually called Chateau Country, which was studded with DuPont estates, everything stank of champagne and caviar. In my mind, Greater Wilmington was like a cartoon from the Great Depression. Here were we poor people crammed into shitty little houses and itty-bitty apartments in and around the city of Wilmington, dressed in our rags and our beat-up bonnets and our boots with our toes sticking out of them, while sprawling to the north and west were the rich in their fat French houses, turned out in silk top hats and evening clothes. They stood in the drawing rooms of their mansions, lighting cigars with $100 bills, their enormous bellies and Margaret Dumont bosoms filled with surety over the natural order of things. The houses of Chateau country were usually hidden by walls or trees, but they would show themselves to you along routes like Kennet Pike or Mont Shannon Road in cunning, winking ways. The slate top of a stucco wall would lower just slightly to give a view of a mansard-roofed manor house. A stone wall would interrupt itself with a wrought iron fence to frame an upsloping green sward. These were the gracious bones thrown to the commoners. The message being, look, but don't touch. As a child, I looked and I ate my heart out over it. As a furious teenager, I only wanted to burn it all down. Keisha didn't have a car, and the one time she saw me at Wendy's, her mother had taken her there for a birthday treat, it turned out. Otherwise, Keisha was thrifty and always packed her lunch. Her mother, I learned, worked nearby as a stocker at a chain drugstore on Concord Pike and would drop her off each morning at the hospital. On the day her mother was off, Keisha would take the bus and then hoof it down the long, skinny road that led to Alfred I. Keisha called her mother by her first name, Carla. Why don't you call your mom Mom? I asked her one day as we ate our lunch together. Keisha with her home-brought stuff and me with some kind of vaguely food-like bag of shit from McDonald's. Because my mom went a nasty piece of work, Keisha said, and she don't much like me. Isn't she religious? I found myself asking. She about as religious as a bull dyke can get. Your mother's gay? I gasped. I'd never encountered such a thing before. If you call it that, she said, but she not frilly at all. At the end of that day, driving home, I passed Keisha waiting for the bus. Standing very straight, library book held up in front of her face, large and unlikely vinyl purse hanging from the crook of her arm like a tea social old lady. I was embarrassed about this shit car. Keep going, I said to myself. I looked in the rearview mirror, Keisha's figure spooling away from me, but then something made me pull over. I backed up in the bus lane and pushed open the passenger door. Want a ride, I called out. She had looked away, expecting some creep, no doubt, but then she leaned forward and saw me. Oh, it's you, she said. And then she smiled, which was a previously unseen event. She was uncommonly beautiful, I realized. Get in, I'll drive you home, I said, taken by a sudden kind of happiness. I'm good, she said. What? I said, that bus takes fucking forever. Hey, mouth, she said. But she got in. I told her she'd lift the door, she closed it, since it was a little out of whack. She did this flawlessly, then put on her seatbelt and looked around the car. Nice ride, she said. Huh? I said, which way is nice? You got a nice car, she said. This piece of shit, I said. You got a car, such as it is, I said. How much you pay? My dad bought it for me, I said. That's a nice dad, she said. This, the richest joke ever, made me snort. So not the case, I said. And then there was a pause, and I thought, she's thinking, you got a dad. Stay on 202 here, she said. I hadn't even thought to ask, where do you live? She lived where black people lived, my mind had figured. Going home to where I lived, to the luckless white people area, I would first turn from Concord Pike onto a route called the Augustine Cutoff, and have a moment of driving through Alapocus, an area of beautiful old stone houses, and then past the John Wanamaker's with its landscaped parking lot tiered like a wedding cake. From there, the cutoff became a truss bridge, passing over Brandywine Creek, which flowed down from Chateau country, bringing its largesse into the city of Wilmington. And that place, down below the bridge, in the parkland beside the Brandywine, held a kind of magic for me, strange to say. It was beautiful there, and it was a beauty that you could touch. It was a public park, but special. I would drive over the Augustine Bridge and picture what was below, that 19th century park so perfectly made, with its winding paths that revealed, then hid, then revealed vistas so surprising and dreamlike. I think of the place we called Josephine Gardens, where there was an alley of cherry trees, blooming like pink heaven in early spring, that led to a fountain that seemed to be so wistful, a fountain with a statue of a woman with her head bowed, as if in mourning. We stayed on 202 instead, and Concord Pike became Concord Avenue, and then we were rolling through the city of Wilmington. We were rolling far over on the east side, a place I'd never ventured. We chatted about this and that, but my eyes were roving all over the landscape. We kept going further out, further east, further over than where I'd imagined Keisha living. The road bent to the left, its name changed again, and we made a turn onto another street, and I felt my head contracting in a way that felt like ignorance or fear. Then we caught a red light, and Keisha told me she'd get out right here. We're here? I asked. I ducked to look out the window, seeing a block of row houses with second-floor bays, some vinyl shingled, some the old brick, some with enclosed porches with improvised windows, much like the neighborhood where I lived, but black. Yeah, it's fine, she said. She already had her hand on the door handle, her purse clutched to her chest. Which one is it, I said. I just gotta get a little something, and then it's close from here. She seemed to be gesturing to a small grocery on the opposite corner. I can wait, I said. I'm fine to drive you to your door. Thanks, girl, she said, already out of the car. She had remembered about the door and lifted and closed it with a click, then pressed it firmly to make sure it stayed closed. She leaned down at the window and looked at me, a sort of privacy in her eyes. Then she turned across the street. There were no other cars on the avenue, so I swooped the car around. The store had a big window, but I didn't see Keisha there. How could she be already gone? But then as I drove away, I thought I saw her walking straight down the way, further out, further east, so far to keep walking. In my mind, I held a speculative map of that place, Wilmington, with its neighborhoods and its hundreds and boundaries and very rich and very poor, and Keisha was walking toward the neighborhood most unknown by me, a place to be glimpsed only from the train, a scanty, wretched, starveling collection of dead-end streets. Can't even call it a neighborhood. Later, I'd look at a map and see that the only street that continued past that way was East 12th, which led to Gander Hill Prison. But she wasn't going to the prison, I knew. Nothing that complicated. She just wanted to keep me away from the sight of her shitty little house. I knew, I smelled this in her because you can drop me here. I did it all the time. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much to DT, thank you to the McGlinn family, thank you to all of you for coming out, thank you to Steve for being a fabulous judge. This isn't a giant, super big cardboard check, but I still want to hand it to DT anyway. So you want to come up? We get a picture. Okay, I think there might be some coffee and brownies left, so make yourselves comfortable, and thank you again for coming. If you haven't read the story, we do have it available at